So recently I wrote up a channel introduction video for non-subscribers, and that video was kind of a spur to think about what I'm actually doing here, right? What my purpose is for the channel. And what I talked about there was an interplay between the roles of musician and fan and critic, right? That the work I do in thinking critically about other artists' songs helps provide perspective and understanding that contribute to my own work, and that my own work as a musician in turn provides some insight into how music works, which has been helpful in critically approaching other artists' material. And, both of those experiences are driven by the enthusiasm I have as a fan. And when I use the term music criticism, I mean the analytical work of trying to take apart what makes the song work, right? Combing through the details, considering the effect of each of the choices that's been made in the writing and recording, taking the back off the watch, having a look at the gears, trying to figure out how it runs. Now, I'm doing music criticism in the context of the internet, and of course the majority of internet music criticism is based on the ranking process, right? This thing is better than this, but it's worse than this other thing. Here are all the things listed, worst to best. But when that format is working, I think it works because it does still provide some kind of a spur for an insight into the nature of that thing, right? This thing is better than this other thing because it has this feature, or it pulls off this particular aspect better, right? And thinking about all that kind of gave me an insight into the underlying process of how we think and talk about music that I found kind of interesting. I just wanted to take a little bit of time to share today. As always, I'm Hans from Electric Brain, Electric Shadow. We are a contemporary art rock project which seeks to make music that is complex but emotionally nuanced and accessible. You can find a couple of album playlists here on YouTube, or you can look us up on Bandcamp or your preferred streaming platform. Now, a few years ago, I read a book called The Righteous Mind by the sociologist Jonathan Haidt, which talks about the roots of morality and the different types of moral values that people have, and how we actually experience the process of making moral judgments, right? And I am going to connect this to music very soon. Now, the point that I'm going to cite here is not Haidt's, I believe. I don't think it was original to that book, but I'm not a trained sociologist, and this was the first place that I had encountered it, so that's what I'm going to cite it to. And the point Haidt makes is that moral judgments begin as an intuition, and then after people have that intuition, they make a post hoc rationalization where they attempt to logically support the intuition they've already had. So if somebody's thinking about a morally controversial topic, they're going to start with an instinctive gut-level judgment about whether that thing is right or wrong, and then they're going to come up with arguments, or in practice, they're going to take arguments that have been presented to them by some kind of authority, and they're going to cite those arguments for the reason why they think the thing that they would have thought anyway. So if you're presented with the issue of, let's say, same-sex marriage, then most of the time you're going to have an intuitive response to whether that's something that should be or shouldn't be socially or legally accepted. And then you're going to, based on that intuitive response one way or another, you're going to try to find some kind of rationale for your pre-existing intuitive opinion. Now, I don't want to go down the rabbit hole of moral psychology because I'm not particularly qualified to do that. But the interesting thing, I think, about music criticism is that it actually functions in a very similar process to morality as it's understood there, right? You listen to something and you start by having a purely subjective, purely intuitive, emotional response to it, right? You like it or you don't. You're moved by it. You're bored. You're kind of intellectually interested but not emotionally engaged, whatever, right? You listen to it and you feel something at a kind of pre-conscious, pre-intellectual, pre-cerebral level. And then if you're putting yourself in a critical position, you have to try to find some way to explain and justify the response that you've already had. Now, there may be all kinds of reasons why you might have a particular emotional response. Maybe it's pure aesthetics. Maybe you've heard other things by that artist that you like or dislike. Maybe your response is filtered through your sense of how that artist behaves as a person. Maybe you have a particular response partly based on the social meaning of a particular work or a particular artist. But no matter what, you're going to have an immediate subjective response, which you then, if you're, putting yourself in the position I've put myself in, you then have to work to find some way to rationalize and argue for. What that means, among other things, is that the same objective observation can be framed as positive or negative, depending on whether it's being processed through a positive or negative subjective response. I have a positive response to the Brazilians, so I try to find some way to credit that to the use of 80s electronics. I have an underwhelmed response to Domino compared to the way that I know a lot of other people feel about that song. I might partly blame that on the use of 80s electronics. Now, if you do the argument skillfully, people may not notice that contradiction, but if they're smart, then maybe they do. And I think the experience of doing the Genesis Songs ranked videos made me more conscious of that gap, right? The gap between the emotional, subjective intuition to a piece and then the process of explaining and defining why you're having that response. It made me more conscious of that gap because of the time gap between when I laid out the list and when I actually recorded and posted the videos. I put all the songs in order back in January, and then began, over time, 10 songs at a time, gradually writing up talking points, recording and posting the videos. So the list was made all at once, but the individual videos addressing the songs, those were made over not too far shy of a year. And one quirk of that process, of course, one quirk of that working method is, if you run into something and decide it really should have been lower on the list, you can't actually move it any lower because you've already done the videos for the lower ranked songs. And of course, I did spend all kinds of time back in January tweaking and rearranging and second guessing and moving things around, but a list of that scale is still always going to have some quirks. So again, what happened with that list is that the two mental processes, the process of subjectively deciding I like this better than this, and then the process of having to rationally argue for why I was having that emotional response, those were exceptionally disentangled from each other time-wise. Doing the top 30 in particular often felt like being handed a list by a stranger and then having to argue for someone else's choice. So I pull up the 29 to 20 list and I think, man, why the hell did you put Just a Job to Do in the top 30, you son of a bitch? I have to go out in public and argue for this. People are going to eat me alive. But I know why I did it, right? Someday in January, I happened to look at that song in a Word document and think, man, I really like that song, and stick it up somewhere in the top 30. And it was because I really do really enjoy listening to that song. The other thing to be said, though, I think, is that sometimes the argument can shift the emotional or intuitive response. It has to, right? Because in the context of morality, it has to have been doing that because people's opinions do change over time, right? I used the example of gay marriage earlier, or same-sex marriage earlier in this video. And of course, the public perception on that has changed immensely in my lifetime in what I think is a positive direction. And the interesting thing then is that in the same way, a good argument can shift one's subjective response to the work. If somebody else has a well-stated opinion, inevitably that can affect how you feel. But then alternately, even the process of having to explain your own opinion can, I think, change what it is. The song Keep It Dark, I'd always thought of that as kind of a middling song from a middling album, frankly. But when I really started talking about it in the course of doing the video, really thinking about the sound crafting, really thinking about the relationship between the lyrical imagery and the sound, really thinking about how the mood of the lyrics and the arrangement are so carefully linked to each other, it really changed how I thought about that song, and by the time that I had edited and posted the video, I realized I probably actually liked and respected it a lot more than I realized I had. This is probably part of why people get upset sometimes about music reviews that they disagree with, right? I think that our subjective response to a song, that is coming from a pre-logical place, and it is something I think that feels as deeply rooted within us and as deeply personal as our response to a tricky or provocative moral question, right? Anyway, just a few stabs toward a theory of music criticism. I appreciate your attention if I've had it, and hope everybody has a good week.